think we'll start, and so I want to introduce my colleague and friend Bhanu Khanna, who's going to actually run us through the work that we've done at WRI over the past decade almost, of really analyzing and understanding the hazard of heat stress in cities from various vantage points, and some of the initiatives solutions that we've really worked with in cities on. And so she's going to walk us through the breadth of our work, and after that we'll get into the panel discussion, and I'll introduce the speakers.
Bhumi Chandar. Take a simit to the
Hi everyone, good evening. We'll start with this nexus of heat, health, housing. The idea of today is that we'll be able to discuss the challenges, the issues, and the way forward for this nexus. And I'll be taking you through a lot of these maps, geospatial analysis, and research that we've done, which has helped us transfer all of this into certain actions that WRI has been taking. So last year, in just 15 days of the April itself, almost 80% of the country's population was facing more than 38 degrees of temperature per day for more than 6 hours, which means this is definitely an uncomfortable temperature, which is leading to loss of productivity and a lot of these health impacts. And most of these sectors are like construction, agriculture, outdoor labor, which is employed in these sectors, which is most vulnerable then, which is putting 2/3 of our economy of the entire country at risk. And this trend is not just today, it's going to continue. This trend is ever increasing, and this trend puts entire ecological equilibrium at jeopardy. So this impact is not limited to heat waves. It's a cascading effect which is leading to droughts, rainfall variability, increase in intensity of cyclones, etc. This is example of one of our studies from Climate Action Plan for Bengaluru, when we were studying this region. So by end of century, while we all know Bangalore is famous for its great weather, it is going to be increasing by 2.5 degrees Celsius by end of the century, which is putting not just the city but the entire Kaveri basin into the risk of rainfall deficit. And this risk of heat stress is not which is experienced similar in the same way for all the cities. It has its variations not just by its intensity or not just by its duration or its geographical location, how it is experienced, at what time of the day it is experienced, for how long in continuation it is experienced, all of this varies. For example, here we are comparing Delhi and Chennai. Just in the month of April and May itself, while Delhi experienced most of the heat stress concentrated in the during this active hours of the day, Chennai experienced it 3 times more, which was spread across the day because Chennai has humidity in play as well. After working across these geographies and through various these research indicators, we've assimilated this whole bank of various indicators that can actually help us understand heat as a hazard, and from heat as a hazard to what nature of exposure does like people, jobs, and ecosystems have, and then who's most sensitive or vulnerable to it. Amongst these parameters, you'll be able to see that it's not just heat as a hazard based on temperature or meteorological parameters. It also includes thermal comfort, built environment, vegetation change, access to amenities, etc., which is very important for anybody to understand, because most of the vulnerabilities depend on those parameters, not just air temperature alone. In terms of these indicators, I'll give example a few of these indicators, how they are in play. So this is air temperature trends combined with some of the extreme events which are associated with air temperature. So for Mumbai, when we were analyzing the same, just in past 25 to 30 years, these trends show that there had been like a decadal shift of 1 degree Celsius, with especially since 2015, you see most of the temperatures are beyond the threshold of normal or the baseline temperature. And Mumbai alone faces 200 plus days every year of extreme heat index. This is one slide that shows that now we've seen what kind of extreme weather events are associated with air temperature, right? But spatially also, we see the heat is not distributed equally. Heat is also spread across to different geographies differently, and cities are epicenter of this heat stress. Due to land surface temperature, concretization of the surfaces, lack of impervious surfaces, unequal distribution of green and blue spaces, heat intensity, which is quoted as heat island effect, is pronounced in the cities. And within cities also, which are actually generally 2 to 4 degrees Celsius higher in terms of their temperature compared to their rural counterparts. Within cities also, there'll be neighborhoods which experience it differently because they are concentration of densities, roofing material, etc., which is more prone to heat. So this is that example. Here on your right, you see Mumbai, and on left is Aurangabad. And the temperature differences in these areas is more than 4 to 6 degrees Celsius. And it's completely because of the nature of their built morphology, the roofing materials, the kind of activities that is happening in these areas. Just Mumbai alone, in these areas which are like 5 to 6 degrees hotter, right? There's like 18 lakh people exposed to this high temperature. Next. And this is not a thing which is like common to just big cities. It's common to all cities, all scales. This is just Patan, which is like 1.5 population in Gujarat. And we tried to map these slums, and we could see that these bastis actually have that differential vulnerabilities idea kind of very clearly seen in these, because they have more than 4 degree temperature difference from their immediate neighborhoods. And the same exercise kind of confirms that there is a need for localized thresholds, because this heat is not uniformly spread. And our way of how we declare heat alerts, that 35 to 40 degrees Celsius alerts thresholds, is not effectively working in these cities. And when it comes to then exposure, it's not just the population which is exposed. As we discussed, economy is exposed as well. And in terms of economy, then not just outdoor workers or these sectors which are like climate sensitive, indoor heat is also a pertinent thing. When we were working with Surat, when our team was working in Surat across MSMEs to analyze their exposure to heat stress, we found that most of the design of these MSMEs is such that people who are exposed to these fuming furnaces, mechanical heat, actually face a lot of health issues. Their wages are lost because they cannot go on daily basis to their jobs. And especially for the cities like Surat, Mumbai, etc., where there's a lot of humidity as well, it's simply hot air blowing, sweat not getting dry, and hence body not cooling down. And this is one example where we have we have compared it with the health data, and we can very clearly see these spikes in the heat stroke cases, which is tallying very well with the temperature data. So you see, like, it's not just 40 degrees Celsius. Just by crossing 34, you have spikes in heat strokes. So again, reiterating the fact that our 40 degrees threshold is not something that's going to work for everyone. And then the impact of the same on health infrastructure is which already is deficient in the country, right? So this distribution of health infrastructure is not equal as well. So people who are generally in these low-lying communities, etc., in the outskirts of the city, generally do not have access to public health infrastructure, which is economical to them. So poor generally have, with this vegetation and the access to green spaces can offer them respite from heat, right? But this distribution of these green spaces and the vegetation is also not equitable in the entire country. So you see in this Kochi example, 60% of the population is actually beyond 10 minutes walking distance of these parks. And this is not limited, this impact is not limited to just the cities. It's actually cascading to the entire ecosystem. Wildfires, human animal conflict, loss in the yield, etc., nutritional loss is all part of this effect. When we were doing this for Tamil Nadu, we did see increase in probability during summer months for forest fires. So at WRI, from past 1 decade, our actions have been sort of divided into this governance, heat action, and scientific scalable methodologies, and empowering communities through data. While in governance, we are focusing on institutionalizing a lot of this research and methods into these climate action plans, state heat mitigation strategies, cool roof solutions, etc. In implementation, it's not just then mere greening. It's testing of these solutions with the cities of how to implement and what works, what doesn't work. Then in terms of these scalable solutions, we've got these scientific methodologies, some of this, a lot of geospatial analysis you've seen, and creating this as a publicly available data set that it's not been just for government, etc., for entire ecosystem to use this, so that our partners can do what they are doing more effectively. This is one of the examples of that decision support tool, which is part of one of our works in MP, where you can just not create a baseline analysis, but you can actually see if you deploy some of these solutions, then how much impact will it have. This is one example of those NBS solutions that have been implemented in Mumbai, like Marol, which is a great example of showing how just optimizing green and blue landscapes in an existing area can help increase the cooling effects in the area. So this photograph is from the Kerala work, where we are working with Anganwadis to deploy some of these cooling solutions where kids are at the highest risk of heat stress. Next. So I'll conclude here the presentation, and this is one diagram I would leave you all to think about this, because our temperatures are going to increase continuously. We are in that constant loop where through our pathways of adaptation and mitigation, we are between climate resilient development, which is an achieved scenario, to where it will be challenged, because there'll be some limits, hard limits, which will be hitting soon. And for today as well, that could be a reality. So the question is, how do we expand or extend our ways of adapting to heat? I'll hand over to Lubaina to continue.
Thank you, Banu. So I just want to introduce our panelists. So this is basically the larger sort of thinking question. As we as a community of practitioners and government actors, we're all sort of approaching these hard limits, right? How do we then address some of these questions? So to deliberate with us today, we have Sir Safi Ehsan Rizvi, who's the advisor mitigation to NDMA. And the executive director of the National Institute of Disaster Management. We have Ma'am Sudha Raman, who's a member secretary, State Planning Commission, Government of Tamil Nadu. Ms. Tanya Kak, who's the portfolio lead, climate and environment at the Rohini Nilekhani Foundation, philanthropist. Dr. Ambrish Datta, welcome. He's the additional professor, epidemiology, Public Health Foundation of India, PHFI. Dr. Swati Mahajan, who's the director, Health System Strengthening at PATH. We have Ms. Shalini Singh, who's the okay, that's a very long. This is a very long title that's put in over here. and Miss Shrishta Singh, who's project associate land rights vertical at Seva Delhi. So welcome everyone. And with this, we are very delayed, so we're going to swap the order a little bit and bring Sudha ma'am here, who has actually a flight to catch. So, ma'am, we wanted to actually talk about the work that Tamil Nadu is doing. There, it's almost sort of the lighthouse state, if you will, in terms of heat action, and the fact that y'all have declared, you're the first state who've declared heat as a disaster. Can you speak a little bit about the efforts that are being taken at the state level to provide the kind of year-round support to access safe, comfortable, not only housing but also health services as part of Tamil Nadu's heat mitigation strategy and some sub-initiatives that you could speak to?
Thank you, Lubina. I think that's an exhaustive question for me to answer. And to start with, I would definitely like to acknowledge the effort of WRI in supporting the government of Tamil Nadu in bringing out the heat mitigation strategy document. So I think that was the first of its kind document that had really come out with respect to heat. So it was back in 2022 when we started this exercise. And then it really got materialized in 2023. So it doesn't sound odd who back, right? But then when we started this exercise of doing this heat mitigation strategy, we had to encounter a lot of challenges because people didn't accept that heat was a disaster, or is a disaster even now. So we had a lot of resistance and a lot of challenges when we brought about this. And still we are facing those challenges. I think any people who are working in different states or with different stakeholders, I'm sure that you'll be able to acknowledge that. Just because it is something very silent, we did not realize. We have been living with it for ages. And we really don't, designate it to be a disaster. Though thanks to NDMA's effort, now the states have declared heat as a state-specific disaster, which gives us the opportunity of utilizing the disaster relief funds as well for taking up the mitigation, adaptation, resilience initiatives. So when we started with this heat mitigation strategy work, it was something holistic. It was like a wish list. We really wanted to work on the action pathways. So we know that a lot of effort is being done traditionally into our culture. We know how we are getting accustomed and acclimatized to the heat. And we have got lots of solutions, local solutions. I means of local solutions, I really insist local solutions because these prescriptions which come out, from Western countries or something are really not going to be working. It is these local solutions, these community initiatives, which are really going to be sustaining and kind of like giving us a long-lasting, sustainable kind of an result as well. So we documented the existing practices and identified the roles and responsibilities of various state functionaries. By means of functionaries, I mean the departments. So when we mapped this exercise, we came to understand that it's all the departments. It's definitely not the kind of a work which is related to the environment and climate change department alone. There is a role definitely for education department, role for the health department, role for municipal administration, role for agriculture, water resources, fisheries, you name it, it is definitely there. And when you talk about the action pathways, I strongly suggest that heat cannot be seen as an standalone or in silos. Heat is something which has to be integrated into the larger umbrella of climate resilience. And when you talk about nature-based solutions or, this mitigation, adaptation solutions for heat, that is definitely inclusive of many other side effects. Because you see the kind of, the change, the surface temperature changes, the urban heat island, the intensified urban heat island effects, which in fact changes the rainfall pattern, intensifies the rainfall pattern, changes the sea surface temperature. For a state like Tamil Nadu, the sea surface temperature is very, very critical because that's definitely going to be influencing on the wind patterns, the rainfall patterns, the humidity, and multiple other things. So, say for example, 45 degrees in Delhi is not same as 41 degrees in Chennai. Okay, with the multiplier, with the humidity, it becomes as a huge multiplier effect, and that really gives us a kind of and stress the fact why heat should be become a kind of an uh, you know uh, exclusive plan has to be worked out to take up this action. And when we started this exercise, it was really at the end of it, we had this document submitted to the government of Tamil Nadu, the Honorable Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, in I think it was in March 2024. And unfortunately, by the August, we had an aero show which happened, and we had 5 people who had passed away because of extreme level of dehydration. So that was right time when this notification had come that he could be declared as a state specific disaster, and the only document that was available to substantiate this effort was the mitigation strategy work what we had done. And that's why Tamil Nadu went about immediately declaring heat as a state specific disaster. Since then, a lot of effort has come. We have taken not just the State Planning Commission, along with the SDMA, we have taken a lot of initiatives. In parallel, we did the urban heat island mapping, the hotspots mapping for the 11 smart cities, the major smart cities of Tamil Nadu. So at ward level, which are the hotspots of the urban heat island effect was mapped. And we also took up a decadal study of we went about doing how the built area has significantly changed, because Tamil Nadu is one state which is very rapidly urbanizing. About 52% of the state is said to be urbanized, and we also have a fact right now that out of this, 37% of the urbanization is happened outside the statutory boundaries of the municipalities and the cities. So that gives you a classic example that the UHIE is definitely not the UHIE. It is the built area which is really contributing to the heat effect. And we did this at the study at the block level, identifying those blocks which have significantly increased this built environment, also has a increase in the urban heat island effect. So that relates us why, and we also went about doing this analysis of the tree cover, the loss in the tree cover also contributing to the increase in the heat. And a lot of effort has gone in to identify nature-based solution, framework for nature-based solution, rural green infrastructure potential, which could be optimally utilized to ensure that this could be mitigation could be taken up. And secondly, not just that, we are the solutions what we largely talk are passive solutions, which are supposed to be yielding results not immediate, which will come really in a long term. But there are some the active solutions, which is like more about reducing your GHG. The more heat, the more air conditioning, you'll be using, and the more GHG, which in turn, contributes to more of UHIEs. So you need to look in for energy efficiency as one of the active solution. And we work with UNEP and seeing how cool roof and using these solutions of energy efficient appliances could be definitely contributing to help us mitigate this. And secondly, when heat became notified as a state disaster, that came with the ex gratia of 4 lakh to the deceased victims who are documented to have died because of heat. So this raises a pertinent question: do you have a mechanism to justify that the death is because of heat? I don't think at that point of time we did. This gave us an opportunity to establish a protocol of how do you define health, heat related ailments, how the health protocol should be evolved exclusively to document any heat related ailments or comorbidities, or to ensure that the death cause is only because of heat. Only when you establish this fact, the victim is going to be having the eligibility to get the ex gratia what's been sanctioned. So these are the kind of different things. Having said that, this is one part of it. And the other part of it is the productivity. Productivity, by means of productivity, I mean to say that agriculture productivity for a state like Tamil Nadu, which is in a drought-prone state, it's very, very essential that the agriculture productivity, livestock productivity should be maintained, and that also brings in the nat- natural resources, which is the forest, and conservation related to that, and to reduce the effect of the forest fire. Multiple initiatives have gone. So these are the overarching kind of, and even this time I won't be able to explain the quantum of the work that we have done. And in parallel, SDMA went about, with the support of CEW, they went about taking the HAPs. Now the HAPs of major cities is being notified. The state action plan for heat is being worked out. The state HAP is being worked out right now. And so now you have everything. There are like several evidences, several researchers which went about establishing. And one work what we are about to be starting very shortly is to determine localized thresholds, because determining a district level threshold is definitely not sufficient. For a district like Trichy, the Trichy city is going to be experiencing a different level of heat, whereas one peripheral block will be experiencing a different level of heat. You cannot be comparing. And on the city and district like Chennai, having this coastal effect and the humidity effect is not going to have the same threshold as the city of Ellur. So you need to have this localized threshold and the mechanisms. So we have initiated this work of taking up this localized heat threshold. I believe that all of this exercises, what we have done, these documents are available online. Any have requested us to share these documents and to find to understand the methodology. I'll be very happy to share it offline as well. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, me. So, sir, I'll bring you in on this on this point here of notifying disasters. So, at the national level, what are some of the opportunities and challenges in notifying heat as a disaster? Is it sort of something that is in the policy discussions, and something we think could give more leverage to states and ULBs to act on some of these important initiatives?
Thankfully, my question wasn't as long. So she gave the answer to that question. The reason why we have only 12 notified disasters in the schedule to the Disaster Management Act is because all 4 windows of the 15th Finance Commission fund allocations can be, I wouldn't use the word easily, can be constructively applied to all those 12 disasters. They are measurable, they are quantifiable. There is a kind of project you can make because you're spending government funds. So if you're spending government funds, you have to have audits, you have to go through everything which is as per procedure. Now, when it comes to the 2 that have been added recently, heat and lightning. Now, there are several issues related to both these hazards. Heat and lightning could have been added as, for all the 4 windows. But the measurement of whether a person has died by lightning strike or by heat stroke is exactly what Madam Raman just mentioned, that it is very difficult to get from the data as to what is the reason for what is the cause of death. Mostly it's the newspaper that tells you that so many people died out of lightning, so many died of heat, and it depends more on which correspondent in which district or which newspaper has been very active and got these 2 catchwords and was able to report that. Now, when you go down in all the cases that are reported at NDMA, we go down to check that, okay, if some newspapers reporting 7 deaths on heat during the heat season, let's take a look at the most important document, that is the postmortem report or the doctor's final assessment of the cause of death. So most of them do not mention that. So if they do not, then you have to lay down a system. In all our discussions, NDMA does a very important 2-day international conference on heat on 2 fixed days of the year, 13th and 14th February. Why they chose 14th of February, I still don't know. But 13th and 14th is fixed. So we decided to stick to the tradition and ruin some people's 14th. And so we found that there are a lot of discussions, a lot of studies internationally. There were some doctors who came from AIMS. There is a very good scientist in the IMD's institution in Pune. They've studied this really in depth. They do have certain solutions. However, they're not very practical to implement countrywide. So it is best that the model that Raman ma'am has just mentioned about states doing their own thing, if the state is comfortable with classifying heat as a disaster, which is amenable to all four of the windows, states should do it. Government of India has only classified heat and lightning in the mitigation window. So in the mitigation window, there are a lot of specific things you can do. Like for heat, you can create all these heat action plans. You can do a lot of other things in hazard assessment, in monitoring, and early warning. So in short, that is the primary reason why we have stuck to just this one window. There's a lot more work to be done. We are encouraging. One thing I'd like to really say and appreciate is that the presence of I won't say a lot of, a few policy non-profits, or you can call them think tanks, like some of them available here right now. They have really helped the entire process of scaling up the creation of heat action plans. Now, we should not say that heat action plans have been created for the first time ever. The professional and skilled manner in which they are being created right now is new. However, the fact that there was mitigation done by the district magistrates for decades and decades is that before every heat season, a little order is put out that, you look after the schools. These days, the school timings will change. The workers will not work in the open. All of this, I've worked in the field since 1989. So I've been seeing these orders for a long time. So whenever we make heat action plans, we should not disregard what is already there. So if things are already there, they've been done for years on, incorporate that into your heat action plan. So it encourages ownership of the municipal corporation or the district officials that, okay, these guys, this paper recognizes what we've been doing and is building on that. So that is a nice policy-oriented way of integrating the past with the future and the modern. Then another gap I do see, especially amongst the policy organizations present here, that all of you work in the plains, occasionally in the coastal areas. Everybody neglects the Himalayas. And the impact of heat on the Himalayas is again what Raman ma'am mentioned. She is so fixated on the Tamil Nadu thing for rightful reasons, but she mentioned forest fire in Tamil Nadu. There are 28 states in India that are impacted by forest fire, and the really, really big ones impacted are Himachal, Uttarakhand, Jammu, and on this side, Arunachal and the northeast and Sikkim also. So the forest fire heat is the direct consequence of heat is forest fire and glacial melt, which is causing glacial lake outburst floods. So the frequency and the problem is going to really grow of both these things. And I'm sure Vishwas is sitting here. They've done a lovely report on heat and monsoons, in which they'll tell you which are the states which are really impacted by both these things. So working in the Himalayas, in those 11 states and union territories, is absolutely critical. And last point to make is that please start encouraging younger, smaller, state level, district level, regional level think tanks, which may be very small. They may not suit your purposes of being very skilled or being very educated on this subject. Educate them, train them so that you can amplify your impact. If today 11 ones are like WRI and CEWI helping Tamil Nadu, then those 11 HAPs that are made, they should encourage even Tehsil level HAPs. And that will come only out of a think tank, which is at the really small level. So I'll stop there. That's a very long answer for short.
Thank you. That covered a lot, and a lot for us to think through. So one of the things that, in conversations with you earlier, you brought about the importance of the lived experience of heat and how, people's bodies experience heat in different conditions, different roles that they. Thank you so much, ma'am. um, how different bodies are impacted by heat based on their exposure, and so on this, I want to actually now go back to our partners who actually work at the ground level, and bring some of these stories. This panel, we wanted to focus on the idea of sort of housing. And so, Shalini ji, first sort of wanted to bring you in on some of the work that Viego's recently done on informal workers, and especially on home-based workers, with this idea of the home itself. Is complicated, right? And what are some of the challenges that come from that? And a sort of tag along question, or to say, how do we then bring some of this quote unquote evidence that seems to be sort of always lacking in this domain? How do we elevate that to policy levels?
So thank you for this opportunity. I work with an international network called WeGo, which works with informal workers, building movement of informal workers, especially women workers. So my perspective to this question is from the labor perspective, from informal workers' perspective, and from the women workers, with a special emphasis on women workers. And as was mentioned earlier, that while the productivity of labor and impact on work has been measured, there's still a gap in knowledge on informal workers who work in informal spaces in the cities. And these informal spaces could be markets, could be roadside, could be shopping centers, but they're also homes. So when we think of homes as only places of habitat, we forget that many informal workers are using their homes also for work. The street vendor may buy in bulk, store it at his home. The waste picker collects waste and does one big level of sorting at his home. You will often see in slums where waste picker live with big mounds of sorted waste. And the home-based workers who only works from her home is a group of workers dominated by women, and they work from their home. Their home is their place of habitat as well as place of work. And I think this understanding is very critical when we look at the impact of heat on productivity and worker and informal workers. The gender question is equally important because this group, in any case, to begin with, is very invisible in the discourse on labor. And then is getting further invisibilized in the discourse on heat and climate change because we are not looking, or we are looking less at home as place of work. In our work, what we have, and this is not a small number, it's not a small group of people, it's just a very invisible group. Let me give you two statistics. 23% of women workers in urban India are in home-based work. And in Delhi itself, there may be about 4 lakh women working from their homes. And they are not just doing crafts, which we think is a home-based kind of work, but they're part of the so-called modern industry where work is being outsourced, whether it is textile or automobile assembly or pharmaceutical, etc. We see a lot of it in the slums of Delhi. I need not tell this august group about what the kind of homes are, the kind of sizes, the infrastructure deficit, etc., and where they are located in the city. When you said that the city itself has different points of heat, how it experiences heat, it's also important who is living and working in those heat islands that we are identifying. So I'm just going to briefly tell you about this study that we have done in Delhi. We are ready to come out with a set of findings. They are still emerging, but just to share with you. So we looked at the most visible and we looked at the most invisible sectors of informal workers. So we looked at street vendors, we looked at home-based workers. And in the interest of time, I'm going to only talk about home-based workers over here, but they are available. So about over 400 women workers were surveyed, and we went in April and asked about March when the weather was a little better, and then in July and asked about June when it was very, very hot. And we were wanting to explore health as an economic stress. We were wanting to also explore the care work that health and economic stress imposes. And finally, we also wanted to know about livelihood, productivity, and insecurity. So what we found was that 85% of the respondents said that in the past month in June, they had visited a doctor. Now, visit to a doctor means added expenses, loss of productive time, and probably an increase in care work, which I will talk about later. 15% said, only 15% out of our sample said they did not miss work due to illness. So a lot of women were missing work due to illness in the hottest months that was happening. And then we asked one question, whether they had reduced their consumption of fruit, milk, or pulses, because, women are, as it is, nutritionally deficit, and then in an era of lowering income, less work, they are the last to eat and the least to eat. And 63% said that the household had reduced fruit, milk, and pulses, which are the sources of protein for the poor. In terms of care burden, 65% said that they spent more than 2 hours to collect water. Now, I want to highlight this, that, we all know that the burden of collecting water and poor sanitation falls on women. But we also have to understand that household level adaptation strategies of keeping the household cool, of bathing, of cooking frequently, etc., also requires an additional amount of water. And there is a water scarcity that is happening. So the work burden of women, the care burden, not of looking after the sick and the old as we understand it, but also just the domestic work really increases, and which will impinge on her economic worth, which is well documented. And also this has to be studied in the context of women's time poverty that we always hear, and women's also falling work participation rate. 85% of the sample that we surveyed said that they also missed work because family or members of family had fallen ill. So the impact of health on care and on productivity and income and on resources of the household is very clear. Now, with this, so this is happening here, but what is happening to their income? The income is also falling. And they said 88% said that they had experienced loss of productivity. And 89% said that they spent more on keeping their houses cool, which means that there is an added expenditure because of health, poor health and the stress that it creates, lowered income, and the added expense of keeping their homes and workplaces cool. So it is an economic burden that heat does on this informal group of workers. And by definition, this informal group of workers lack social security, have very low income, home-based, particularly within the informal sectors, are at the bottom of the pyramid and have very little or no social security. Yes, please.
This 88% experience loss of productivity. These 88% were people who were speaking to you in June?
Yes. So this is in June. I'm giving you the data that are presented as compared to March. March was a better month. That was not so hot. And less people were. So this is a data that we have. And what we see is insecurity and vulnerability, which manifests itself in many different ways, not just income, but also increase in care burden, it also increase in work. And in our interviews, many of the women said that, because of this, they are working at different times of the day. They are looking to collect water and do other kind of domestic chores. The mental health, they are not able to sleep well. They are not able to look after themselves and that of the family. So this is where I'm going to stop in terms of the findings of this survey. I I think what we have been asking for is that the heat action plans takes into account informal spaces of work and informal workers, including those who work from their homes. And that's one. And two, that in its implementation and design, what is the role of collectives of these informal workers that they can play? Because there is a lot of wisdom at the bottom, as Sir pointed out, and whether it is the role of awareness raising, whether it is peer looking after each other and watching out for heat stress or heat this thing, or whether we develop places of work as cool places of work, which means that we have markets, we have addas where the construction workers collect, we have dhalaos where the waste pickers are. How are we designing it? And in a more broader aspect, I think the question is also, as we build climate resilient cities, how are we looking at informal workers and informal spaces?
Thank you. That was very comprehensive. So, Shrestha, on a similar sort of vein, Seva's done a lot of work in waste worker communities. And when we spoke, you also talked about other sort of associated infrastructure challenges that further sort of create these compounding burdens. If you could speak a little bit about that through findings, and again, talk about how some of these interventions can be then elevated to policy or HAPs. Yeah.
Okay. Good evening to everyone. I will try to share what Seva has been doing with waste pickers or on heat in general, and also share as the focus was to understand the lived experience, anecdotes, and whatever we've heard from the field, we've learned from the field. So currently we're in a state of trying to understand and build evidence around how heat is impacting informal workers, because as Shalini Behan rightly said, there's not so much focus still there. So we've started that work, and we work with waste picker communities, home-based workers, street vendors, and domestic workers. And in that, we have tried to understand how mostly the heat impacts their livelihoods and labor productivity. But here's where I would also like to bring in housing and say that livelihoods of informal workers are deeply tied to their housing conditions in terms of the choices of housing they made, the nature, the location, or the investments that they would later put in that housing unit. So when I'm talking about housing here, I would like to frame it from the sense that our housing is not just a house. It's an assemblage of services, work, location, as well as tenure. And that feeds into how heat interacts and the impacts that are felt. And as you said, like the compounding health impacts that would be seen later. So in terms of our work with Viego, actually, we tried to map heat in Delhi, and we identified hotspots where it was observed that urban family settlements in Delhi sort of overlap with these particular hotspots, which because of the reasons that we've already discussed, like heat island effects, the density of the informal settlements, the ground cover. We see where this is where the heat compounds, and this is where we also find most of our informal workers. And while we talked about the heat action plan, and the heat action plan does recognize vulnerable population, at least some of them, whether women, whether elderly and children, but it treats them as a homogeneous group, is what we see. And it doesn't translate into very targeted interventions for, let's say, a group of waste pickers or indoor workers. So I think the fact that we're spending good time talking about women informal workers, where both these identities sort of intersect, would be worthwhile, and I'm glad that we're doing that here because gender socioeconomic disparities. Women do have fewer resources to recover in terms of heat-induced losses, and that is something perhaps we can understand more when we look at this intersection, particularly. With waste pickers, we see a major loss of work hours. We have asked them across the year when we interact with them, which is the worst season to work with? And the answer has been consistent. It's during the heat, even though monsoon means that they are losing the material that they work with. Heat is debilitating for them to work. They have to change their working hours. And in previous, they've shared the experience that because they shift their working hours to earlier hours of the morning or even night at some times, that leads to an increased harassment that they face. And that is not a link you draw while like just talking to them. That's something a lived experience would teach you. We also see that a lot of waste picker communities to sort of supplement their income in Bhalasba in Delhi work with tuna. So they pack edible lime powder into bottles and they do that work in their home. And there has been accidents where the tuna has exploded because of the heat trapped within their houses and has led to accidents. So we see that there's an increased occupational hazard for workers working from home, workers working outside. We also actually conducted a short survey study where we try to understand the health impact with informal workers, and what we noticed there that there's a recognition that workers are able to associate immediate health impacts that they might feel, for example, fatigue, dehydration, strokes. But when it comes to health outcomes that manifest over a long period of time, reproductive health, especially for women, or increased menstrual cramping, the association is not there within the community itself. And it's something we also would like to perhaps, when later Dr. Swati talk, Dr. Tanya talk, can bring in how to draw that causality and understand that within the sort of evidence building we are trying to do. And I think Shaniyan has already talked about it. The increased consumption of water and electricity, the coping strategies that they reported has been mostly bathing 2 to 3 times a day. And these are households that struggle to get water. These are households that have to purchase either drinking water they purchase at an everyday basis, or to get water for daily use, they have to go through a complex system of both privately and publicly provisioned waters. Every day is a struggle to get that water. And the coping strategies, when it becomes bathing more, mopping floors more, or like adding more appliances to the house, like fans or coolers if they can afford it, is an increased financial burden that they do have to face. And in face of that, it jeopardizes the money that they can now put or reinvest back into making their homes resilient, or bringing in interventions like cooling infrastructure, etc. Again, we tried to map infrastructure across Delhi during this study, and we realized that some in New Ashok, for example, a slightly well-to-do unauthorized colony in Delhi towards the east, in the East District, we see households purchase air conditioners at second-hand, third-hand basis. And when these streets in these settlements are 2 or 3 meter wide, and sometimes not even that much, and when the exhaust of the air conditioners sort of open into these gullies, you see a sort of cyclical effect that occurs. These spaces already face very high land surface temperatures, and when they try to cope with active cooling solutions like air conditioners, which is the most that they can actually have access to, we see this sort of cycle build-up of air conditioners heating, urban island effect, and the heating continues and compounding financial burdens for them. So, I'll bring it to a close and maybe discuss later and during the question answers round that when we're thinking about housing, yes, there's the materiality, informal settlements have to be considered, and there are cool roofing solutions that are there. But what we have observed in our work, until there is basic infrastructure, and by infrastructure I mean civic amenities like water, sanitation, waste management present in these spaces, we cannot think, or the communities cannot think so much about having cooling roof solutions, for example, in the place. That's why when we talk about housing, it has to be viewed from the lens of, are these spaces adequate? Are these houses affordable? Can people afford the cooling solutions they're being given? And at the end, are these spaces viable? Are houses viable? do they play a role in building that sort of resilience for their livelihoods and for these better health outcomes? I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Shrishta. I Yeah, but also the Seva's work has been in the sector for, but yeah, it's the same, also the same study. Dylan, I want to bring you in. So I forgot to introduce you in the panel. Dylan Subramaniam is my colleague, program manager in the energy team at WRI, and has been working on sort of the building side of solutions. So from the work that you all have done in Kerala, if you could speak to some of the findings that sort of resonate with what Shalini ji and Shrestha spoke about, in specifically, Anganwadis and schools that you all have looked at the issue, and how is that sort of informing also certain material and skill based interventions that you all have identified?
Yeah, thanks, Rubina. I'm glad that Shalini brought up the importance of skilling, local skilling, and how to make the local masons and contractors skill so that they can contribute to building more buildings with more features, passive building features, which can then contribute to thermal comfort. So we have been working in Kerala for the past 4+ years, mainly focusing on mainstreaming sustainable practices and all. But then again, as Lubaina pointed out, our focus has been mainly on buildings. And within building sector itself, we were mainly focusing affordable housing segment and Anganwadis as well. So as you would have seen in Banu's presentation, the larger research question that we were trying to understand in Kerala was that we actually wanted to understand how effective are these buildings when it comes to addressing the thermal comfort needs of vulnerable communities who are occupied by these buildings. For obvious reasons, we have picked Anganwadis, given that the children, because of their age group, they are inherently vulnerable. But at the same time, we were also really curious to understand what is the condition of, or how effective the affordable housing segment is when it comes to thermal comfort. So what we did was that we partnered with state agencies like Kerala State Disaster Management Authority and Life Mission. Life Mission is the state affordable housing program for the state, for Kerala. So as a part of this whole effort, what we did, we have surveyed around 600 buildings, including Anganwadis, informal houses, and then affordable houses as well. We have almost covered all the districts in Kerala, but now, very surprisingly, like majority of these buildings were built without considering any sort of climate resilient features, let alone heat resilience. But many of them have not been considering any passive building features which could have been there, which could have improved the thermal comfort situation of these homes. So then we asked what could be the reason why this is not happening on ground. So we did ask this question during the surveys as well. So what we could identify is that there are mainly two reasons. First reason is that the people who are involved in the construction of such buildings, including affordable, let it be housing, let it be affordable houses, let it be Anganwadis, these people are not skilled, or they don't have the expertise on passive building design or construction practices. So that's reason number one. Second reason, the beneficiaries themselves who are being occupied by these buildings, they don't really care about the health impacts of heat stress, and they don't actually have the access to technical knowledge to incorporate such things. This is where like the point that highlighted by Shalini comes. So if we want to address this information gap, we had a consultation. We had several rounds of consultations with state agencies in Kerala, with the support of Life Mission. What we did was that we developed a regional guideline guideline documents for North, South, and Central Kerala. Given that Kerala is very diverse, very unique when it comes to climate and geographic features, we actually wanted to factor in this specificities, geographic specificities as well. Also, because the material available in these regions are different, so actually we want to see the document reflecting all these different sort of specificities. So. But that's just a start. We are very much aware that this guideline document is not the solution, and this guideline document will not be able to solve all the problem. But then at the same time, we are also trying to see how we can train these contractors and masons so that they will be able to make use of these guidelines and will be able to construct such homes. These guidelines, these are guidelines are the things that we have included in these guidelines are not very super scientific or nothing like that. The thing is that we are most of them, given that they have their own limitations when it comes to financial. The amount, the kind of money that they could spend on such projects. So we have tried to make these guidelines as cheap as possible, so that these are no cost, low cost kind of interventions, mainly on design level thing. But then we are hoping that once they are aware of such solutions, once the contractors and masons are aware of such solutions, we will be able to address this information gap. Yeah, I'll pause here.
Great. Thanks, Dylan. That was helpful to sort of bring it back to the housing question. So, and now I'd want to invite our colleagues who are joining, who are going to sort of share more from the health perspective. So, Dr. Swati, a lot has been discussed in terms of some of the impacts that people are feeling. From the kind of health systems point of view, if you could respond to the overall burden that the health ecosystem is facing, and even sort of departmental burdens in the public health system, and if you could sort of share a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for inviting me. It was really, really enlightening to listen to all the fellow colleagues. I will largely focus on health systems because part works mostly with health facilities and health systems. Coming to your question, I think while a lot has been said in this room about how heat impacts health, but it is, and also a lot about housing and systems. So I think it's a compounding crisis which affects health, urban systems, as well as, it also affects the livelihoods, especially for the most vulnerable populations in the urban settings, the informal ones that we're trying to see. So we see a spectrum of health impacts. These vary from very mild ones like exhaustion, dehydration, heat strokes, to very serious ones like cardiovascular strain, mental health impacts, dizziness, and chronic respiratory disorders. So there's a wide spectrum of impacts that we are seeing, and especially we see that the vulnerable groups that have been called out in this conversation, like pregnant women, children, those with existing comorbidities, elderly, they face intergenerational risks. So these risks keep compounding, and then you see these manifesting in the form of maternal and newborn health complications, undernutrition, or you would see, increasing disease burdens that we are now witnessing. So we are already doing a project which is called Care MNH, which means we're trying to develop climate adaptive, resilient ecosystems for maternal and newborn health. So in this, what we've seen is because maternal unit, so we've reviewed around 100 publications, and we see very strong existing correlations between heat and air quality and its impact on low birth weight, preterm birth, and preeclampsia. And so now what we're trying to do is we're trying to design heat and air quality adaptation plans more focused on MNH outcomes. Especially we're working with the state of Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra. And last week only the state government has kind of allotted us Ujjain in Madhya Pradesh and Pune in Maharashtra to develop these plans. These plans will specifically focus on MNH outcomes. And we all have spoken that there are already plans being developed. So what will be the difference? So these plans are supposed to be laying out what are the system level interventions, community level interventions, and individual level interventions that can be taken to mitigate the impact of these climate risks, especially focusing on heat and air quality. And because we do understand from a health systems perspective that whenever new programs are brought in, if they are very siloed, their uptake is going to be very limited. Financing is always going to be an issue, and skilling is also going to be a challenge, because health workforce is always, in acute shortage, and they're always overwhelmed. So what we're trying to also propose is we're trying to identify integration touch points where the interventions that we propose will integrate into the existing MNH programs, so that we adopt an ecosystem level approach rather than creating siloed plans. And we're also mapping all the existing funding line items that are available under the National Program for Climate Change and Human Health and all other existing schemes, to also identify what are the funding gaps, so that it's a very, very clear plan with time-bound actions and also determined roles and responsibilities metrics. So I think these kind of interventions are going to be helpful. In terms of, you also spoke about your question, if I take it in two parts, what have been the impacts on the health system? So I think one of it is, of course, very, very obvious, an increase in caseloads. Whenever there are heat waves, we see surges in outpatient departments, in emergencies. So increase in caseloads is definitely something which we all understand. But I think because this is straining an already overwhelmed system, so it also exposes the gaps that our health systems and health workers have. And in most of the states, we see health facilities have no early warning systems. There are no heat adaptation plans. There are no protocols. Surveillance systems and referral systems are often fragmented. So all of this in turn results in, delayed treatment. And one thing that we're also seeing is a change in disease burden. There is an increased transmission of vector-borne diseases. The vector ecology is changing. States which never had incidents of vector-borne diseases are now reporting those. And there is an increasing, emergence of infectious diseases, re-emerging diseases, zoonotic diseases. So all of these, while there are challenges which are very explicit and obvious at this moment, but there are also many forthcoming challenges that the health systems need to be prepared for. And so some of the interventions that we're doing, so one of the programs that we've done jointly with Art Park is around designing a climate-informed early warning system for dengue. So in this, we're layering so we've got, the IHIP data, which is for surveillance. So on the top of it, we're trying to layer temperature, humidity, rainfall patterns to be able to generate 2 to 4 week predictive risk maps for dengue, which in turn are very useful at the district and sub-district level for surveillance, testing, and also early outbreak response. So currently these maps have, say, an accuracy of around 68 to 70%. But as we get better quality data, we are very hopeful that this will improve. So we're currently implementing this in Odisha. Last year, we also won a BIRAC Grand Challenge around the same for designing a solution called Sanketar, which will inform the state of UP on how much their disease burden of vector-borne diseases will increase in the next 3 years, which in turn will help them in forecast-based financing so that they can make preemptive allocations for the number of cases that they can expect over the next 3 years. So I think such kind of solutions are preparing health systems. But specifically coming back to again the question of heat, I think while these are larger system level interventions, but there are very small facility level interventions also that can be done. So one of the projects that we're currently doing is called CHIP. It is Critical Health Infrastructure Project. So in this, basically, we're trying to combine advanced simulation techniques with human-centered design to come up with a menu of low-cost retrofits and strategies, especially for heat and flooding. So in this, we take facility-level inputs like the facility coordinates, their layouts, if the floor plans are available, staff inputs on where do they see the sunrises, where do they feel that it's very hot, what times of the day. And then we combine this with simulation techniques like a sun path diagram, mapping the air flow and wind velocity of the facilities to come up with a tailored menu of the facility that if you're trying to place a shade, or if you're trying to place a retrofit solution, where it should be placed, where it will be most effective. And then also kind of trying to embed these into behavior change interventions and trainings for health workers. So I think a lot of these interventions are currently being done, and that's how health systems are getting strained, but also they're getting prepared at the same time.
Thank you. Really interesting. So, Dr. Amrish, Um, I wanted to bring you on sort of talking about what are some of the research goals that we can and this also sort of speaks to our collaboration on at the nexus of health, heat and housing that we've been talking about. What are some of the research goals that that you're working with and that need to sort of that we as a community need to take on to really build the kind of evidence that we need to elevate this problem and reach some of these effective outcomes.
Thanks a lot to WRI for giving me this opportunity to speak to this August gathering. I just, fantastic talks I had been listening to. I just want to make 2 or 3 issues. I started working on this from 2016 onwards with NDMA at that time. We were funded by NDMA for a study, sir. And also OSDMA being very proactive, who was always a partner. I work from IIPH Bhubaneswar, so I'm based at the intersection of heat and extreme weather events also. Sir, taking a cue from what you had said, extreme heat is definitely a very big problem. But my mentor, Professor Dilip Mavlankar, who was the director of Gandhinagar IIPH, taught me, don't look at 40 and above. Look from 35 to 40, because that is going to be 150 days of the year. And if you look at the population attributable fraction of that, how it impacts the population, not probably causing heat stroke of what we are talking about, but just by increasing all-cause mortality, it is almost 200 times than those 40-45 red days. The orange is where the problem lies. And if we really want to measure our housing or whatever policies we are planning here, I'm not a policymaker, I'm an epidemiologist. I give you the causal that you were looking for. It is the 36.5 onwards in Bhubaneswar, which increases the all-cause mortality, not heat stroke. All-cause mortality, for each degree rise, there is a 16% increase in all-cause mortality. Various causes, diabetes, dehydration, heart disease, everything. So it is this period which really impacts the population. Not June, maybe April, maybe October. And add to that the lethal humidity. That really makes that intersection, and then comes the role of the housing. That is really where things are, heat stroke, she showed the slide. If you look at the heat stroke slide, there are 5 to 7 heat stroke cases per day. It increased from 3 to 7 when the temperature rose. I'm talking about 3,000 to 5,000 on those days, because I'm talking about all-cause mortality. And that is what we had done with that NDMA paper in 2017, where the all-cause mortality of Bhubaneswar over a 13-year period showed an increase on temperature just rising beyond 36.5 degrees centigrade, sir. So that is where the orange problem lies. And the orange is a very big chunk as compared to the red. That's my first point, which I wanted to make. And that's where we need to do our preparation and impact analysis. Now, many health outcomes, as Dr. Swati has rightly put, are improving. India is improving. All the health outcomes are improving. So many deniers would say, why bother? Many policymakers say, why bother? Everything is improving. But if you look at the rate of improvement of many of the health outcomes like preterm birth, low birth weight, infant mortality, neonatal mortality, they have started slowing down. So we are losing decades of progress that we had made in probably years. So again, this is data. We are still improving. We will be improving for another maybe 10, 20 years, 30 years. Maybe France may be going down because of heat. We will not, because other factors are sort of overwhelming the effect of heat. but there is a deceleration in this progress. The data points clearly show. Large data sets we need for that. We are getting it slowly. But sir, it would be fantastic if NDMAs and other disaster management authorities make just all-cause mortality, burning heart data for us available maybe over a 10-year period. We can juxtapose it with just temperature data and get fantastic patterns out of it. But that data is not always available. Just all-cause mortality. Fantastic. Another point I would like to make. Night temperature, where housing plays the most important role. The night temperature is the effect modifier, as we call it. Heat and health. Heat is the exposure, health is the outcome. The biggest effect modifier or the moderator is the housing, which determines the nighttime temperature. A 45-degree day with a 28-degree night is much preferable than a 35-degree day with a 32-degree night. It's very clear. Data shows it as clearly as possible. If the night temperature is cool enough, your body physiology, your homeostasis gets a lot of time to cool down and fight the stress and hazard of heat. But a 35 and a 32-degree day and night temperature is a real killer. Clear population attributable fractions are there, calculable, estimable. And that is where the housing comes into a big way. And that's why we were trying to collaborate with WRI in a big way. The housing pattern, wind flow, cool roofing, access to basic amenities, access to dignified labor, some affordability can be a complete game changer by changing the nighttime temperatures. It can ward off the daytime heat hazard to a great extent. I'm not condoning that we should not work for daytime mitigation. Definitely it should be done. Changes in working patterns and things like that. But definitely nighttime temperature is a big amplifier of the daytime heat. I think I've already created a lot of sensation. The last one which I'm trying to say is that we recently did an analysis with simple NFHS 5 data, because NFHS 5 data has a lot of environmental data recently. It's becoming more and more sophisticated in Indian data, sir. It shows very clearly in the Indo-Gangetic plain, there are more adverse birth outcomes in 2 months of winter, nothing to do with heat, the other way around, than during the hot months. Strangely enough, sir. Again, the population figures are greater during the winter months. But again, it is something to do with heat. Meteorologists sitting here know much better than me. It's the inversion during winter which captures the pollution and which causes, and it's because of the heat. The ambient heat is increasing. It's causing more inversion and more entrapment of pollutants during the winter, which is causing wreaking havoc. It's killing more, it's not killing, sorry, it's causing more preterm birth and low birth weight also, which is an indirect effect of increase in ambient heat. Again, where the housing can be a great moderator by trying to change the pattern of exposure to all these pollutants. So today's topic of heat, health, and housing nexus. I don't know, does nexus has a negative connotation? No, it can have a positive connotation also. So this heat, health, housing intersection has a very large role to play. Ultimately, everything will be judged by how healthy we are, not how green or blue or whatever we are, but how healthy we are at the end of the day. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you. That definitely takes us to sort of the last question, and I want to bring you, Tanya, on this idea that how can philanthropic support for localized heat action planning, some of this work that is already happening, urban heat resilience measures, etc. We're already seeing all of that in some way. Where do you see some of the support sort of accelerating the need for more evidence, the need for sort of maybe more patient and evaluative work, research? What are some of the sort of ways to address this multidimensional crisis?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I think the answer probably already lies in the rich sort of insights that have emerged from the group, and I think philanthropy must respond to that. But I'm going to speak a little bit to the motivation with which we started a few years ago, when we started building out this work. And that's essentially for any societal level challenge. I think our approach has always been to go back to what Rohini articulates as Samaj, Sarkar, Bazaar, and the interplay between these three, which is very crucial. Although we over-index at the foundation towards Samaj, because we see that as a place where, or as a pillar to which Sarkar and Bazaar must respond. And so that's an approach we very much sort of took for heat as well. I think what we were curious about a few years ago was policy was definitely a first mover. So in that heat action plans, and many have spoken about that, we were also motivated to support them for the short term and look at how some of the immediate needs of the communities could be addressed. So CEWs, IIHS, C-STEPS, a few of these organizations working very closely with governments across India. And at the central level, we were very interested in supporting a lot of these national level plans or state level plans. But I think soon we realized that there also needs to be a conversation that's happening that needs to happen parallelly, that uncovers the truths of the lived reality of heat between different sort of communities on the ground. Which is when we supported the work of 14 partners and took a learning approach to this sometime 2 years ago. And the idea very much was that before we can get at the right solutions, can we ask the right questions with them? And I think there are some emerging sort of insights that have come through, which very much echo what's already been said in the room. But just for the sake of brevity, I'm going to capture them in 4 core insights. One was, of course, that heat is treated as an event, but it is very much lived as a daily condition. So how do you unlock, the response from being just as an episodic event to something that's systemic, chronic, and structural in its nature? The second one is that heat is not just a compounding risk in and of itself, but it also compounds the inequalities that you see in society. So, many of the, like Shalini, Shrestha, so many have sort of pointed out, the gendered sort of experience of heat as a lived condition. And some of our partners are looking at mental health impacts on informal workforce for heat, so on and so forth. And I'm sure there are sort of many heterogeneous sort of groups, by which you can disaggregate this data. Because we keep talking about hyperlocal data to feed into policy. And the third, which bears repeating at multiple times, is that heat by different communities, and our partners kept sort of highlighting this again and again. For instance, Prayas Energy and Health Group, they worked quite a bit on just diagnosing and working with these communities in Pune, for instance. Heat is often downplayed as a daily lived condition by communities themselves. It's not out of ignorance in tier 2 and tier 3 cities where typically it's not seen as a challenge. And that's primarily because it's a choice between safety versus survival, right? So if I'm a daily wage worker, then my choice is, if I accept heat as a condition that's affecting me, then it also has direct sort of repercussions for my productivity. So that made us think a little bit beyond the questions of technical, which are very important, technical solutions, heat action plans, very, very important, right? And they might say, drink water, but for a daily wage worker who doesn't have access, or a street vendor who doesn't have access to public toilets, they won't drink water. So I think for us, the question then became, how do you look at heat as a system and not just as an episodic event that needs to be reacted to, But I think that's also true for disasters of any kinds. What is a longer term resilience arc that we're embedding in institutions, in stakeholders that are responding to this as a challenge? And then for us, I think the role of philanthropy was, of course, we keep talking about it as catalytic and, unlocking and hedging the risks that, governments and markets cannot take. So I see it very much as playing that role as well, which is granularity of data, evidence generation. But I think that, and we were very strong believers of early warning systems, for instance, really playing that role. But for a person who doesn't want to recognize heat as a challenge because it has repercussions for their daily wages, what difference does the early warning system really make? So I think we realize that information alone is not sufficient. We need structural support to kick in, and we need several of these nodes to speak to each other. So I think all investments that we are now making going forward would be looking at how can we look at heat as an intersectional crisis, and across, I would say, that we're imagining it, when I say heat as a system, what does it mean? I'm imagining it to have 4 broad pillars, right? Within that framework of Samaj, Sarkar, Bazaar. So does any program that come to us accelerate agency? What does it say about equity? What does it say about the adaptive capacity beyond just the technical solutions that come in? And then the final consideration is also around scale, for instance. So sometimes programs can be a combination of these. Sometimes they can isolatedly, work with some of them. But I think if we want to build the longer term resilience arc, and what does that mean? Our partners, for instance, kept highlighting to us, communities are already resilient. So this jargon around resilience or empowerment can sometimes feel empty because it takes away the onus from the structures that need to respond to them. So we're looking at balancing what does it's maybe in a lighter note. Again, Rohini articulates this as what does it take to build a Sheetal Samaj? So I think we're looking at what does it mean to build that public imagination of moving from heat as a episodic event to something that's systemic and more intentional.
Great. That's actually a really great point to conclude this conversation. And thank you very much for being so patient. And I've been really very liberal moderator today. Very unlike my usual. Yeah, I was an unmoderate moderator because it was just really good to actually hear all of the interventions, so I did not want to interrupt. I want to bring in my colleague Jaya Dindo, Executive Director, Sustainable Cities at WRI India, to actually just do some closing, concluding remarks. Yeah.
Thanks, Lubaina, and thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts. I'm actually going to pick up from where you left off, Tanya, that heat is basically a classic systems problem. And so it will not have straight linear solutions. It's going to have sort of complicated systemic solutions that we will have to address, and that's very clear. I think the ideology that we are trying to work with here is what's over there, right? Like, how do we extend our limits of adaptation? There are limits, we recognize it. How do we extend that? And is there a way to address vulnerability within that so that we look at really cooling, for example, the bottom 50%? And what will it take to do that? So I think from what I heard, basically that there are a lot of gaps. There are data gaps, who, where, what, to what extents, at what thresholds, who's vulnerable, and whether it's ecology, whether it's human beings, whether it's informal workers who are not a monolith, the way we think of them. So, those are data gaps that we need to fill. There are infrastructure and solution gaps. So when we look at things like home-based work, the environments in which people are living, in which they're operating, what kind of solutions are available to them which are not a financial burden? And is there a spectrum of solutions that can be targeted or that can be, accessed by all of these individuals? There are contractual gaps, quite frankly. There are societal contracts which don't work, for example, with informal workers and the kind of societal contracts that we've built. And there are service contract gaps. So when we look at medical forms and them not sort of talking about what was the cause of, the death, and not recognizing that, maybe it was an underlying health condition, but really the tipping point was the heat stress. There's clearly awareness gaps. I think the number of deaths in India that get reported, and they're severely underreported, but a lot of that is quite frankly preventable. And so there's a lot of awareness gaps on the part of community at large, on the part of people who are trying to work in this ecosystem. And then there are planning gaps. So when we look at design of built form, when we look at the areas which are outside of our city, peri-urban areas, and those areas which have very little planning happening, very little vegetation that exists there, and sort of some of the slum areas, some of the informal settlements which have zero planning, there are those planning gaps. So I think when we come to what is it that I think all of us collectively need to do, I think one is very clearly data always, start by making the impacts visible is a great way to go about it. Thinking about, for example, the impact on school children, their health, their education, and those kind of outcomes, looking at amplifiers like air quality, what kind of impact does that have, for example, on heat? Second is recognition in disaster frameworks, health frameworks, and how do we bring that together? And Tamil Nadu, for example, is trying to do that quite well. So how do we kind of proliferate more of that thinking? Third is, I think, awareness at disaggregated levels. What are the things that we need to build awareness around? Differential vulnerability. How do we communicate that better? How do we create campaigns, voices around that communicate that better? A lot of the work that WeGo and others are doing. Solution sets, what Sir said, acknowledge existing practices. We are not starting from scratch. So acknowledge existing practices, things that worked in the past, things that are working now, and how do we build on top of those practices? Planning frameworks, and I'll talk about transitional areas because we talked about that this morning in our opening plenary, is areas like small towns, medium-sized cities, peri-urban areas which don't come under current planning frameworks. How do we talk about better planning? And those are the places which really pay the price, and the people living there, and a lot of them are informal workers, they pay the price. And when you look at some of the climate action plans that we've made and the maps around heat and UHI, those areas are all lit up red, right? So how do we create planning frameworks which include these places within their ambit? And finally, it's really about dialogue. So when we're talking about like this kind of sharing, what you shared from a health perspective, what others shared, I think just between planners, between health practitioners, community groups, to just share learning so that we can think about what are the solution sets that exist there that would expand our understanding, and then how do you accelerate what works, because really we're in a state of emergency and we need to think about speed and scale. And I think one of the ways that I'll end by saying, partnerships and sort of this dialogue is one of the forums that we've created, co-created really. It's the India Forum for Nature-Based Solution. Ruchika is there, Vishwas is there. They're all part of this, forum, and we are collectively with a group of bunch of partners. We're looking at nature-based solutions and the kind of role that it can have in urban systems. So can we create more of these partnerships and platforms to take some of this, collective dialogue forward? So yeah, I'll stop there. And I noticed everyone, not just me, everyone was furiously scribbling notes. So sir, if you have anything to share as a closing.
Okay. So a closing after the closing. So that was a very nice summary. It was like an AI chatbot, It's a very good summary. You had everybody's important points, and I hope you don't use long dashes in your thing, like Chat GPT. So, I mean, there's a lot of points I've written because it's a lot of value added for me for all these heat focused conferences, seminars that I attend. I get to learn a lot more. And every time I keep bouncing it off against the policy challenges that one hears in the government side. So, the 3-4 things I like to address. One is the data point that you made. So data is something that doesn't reside with us, and data lies in so many ministries in government of India, and it does not lie in many ministries. It lies all over the place in state governments, and I would say that would be just about 15-20% of it. A lot of it lies in the open domain. A lot of it lies in district hospitals. So data on health of humans is something which is seriously disaggregated. So which is why that point about getting local level think tanks to work. If you've done a study on 400 cohorts of people alongside your organization, this is something that needs to be done more and more and more. And there's a very nice study by the Indian Statistical Institute again on 400. I don't know why you guys focus on 400, but they've also found that 1 degree increase in temperature loses 6% of wages. That's a very nice study by Dr. Somanathan. So that's one point on data. So data disaggregated, that's the existing story. You can't do much to change it. You can't ask anybody for it. Nobody will get it for you. You keep asking. You just look at what is available and work on that. On the fact that we are only looking at human health, that is something that a government of India and state governments, they have to focus on health of crops, health of animals, health of infrastructure, and health of forests. So these five are actually massive verticals in their own. Health, human health is because all of us are totally invested in that. But 3x of our population are the animals. So we have the entire Ministry of Department of Animal Husbandry, Department of Agriculture, all those for that work. That is something which is a bit of a gray area where high level thought like this one doesn't enter. So maybe that is another open space. Insurance has not been mentioned. So Seva has worked a lot on insurance with MHT, and these guys are already on their third phase of a heat product, which is working successfully. In the second phase, they were able to do, they've taken the parametric insurance line of work. So the parametric insurance line of work for informal workers is the best possible theoretical as well as practical thing to do. So they have already done it. They've demonstrated in their second phase how they gave payouts to the workers. The problem in insurance is who pays the premium. So if the government pays the premium or a non-profit pays the premium, you will end up in trouble after a year or 2 years or 3 years because the government or the non-profit or the for-profit cannot continue to subsidize premium because the payouts will always be less than the aggregate premium. So it has to be taken from the workers, and once there is a payout in 1 year, then the workers themselves will want to take that premium. So the presence of a product which is accessible to them and it's easier to them with a very small premium, if it is divided over 1 million workers, makes a huge difference. Insurance is the way to go, where some kind of financial resilience comes to all the brilliant points that were made about how it impacts people's productivity and their health and all those 88, 89% numbers. That will help them. So I think you guys should take a session on for all of us, and maybe in the next one you could have a financial resilience thing. The last thing is bringing in corporations and making everything a for-profit exercise. So this is a mostly non-profit. So non-profit is dependent on somebody feeling the need, just out of the goodness of his or her heart. Whereas for-profit is that there is an interest that, so speed will be coming only when there is for-profit commercial activity. So one example is Cool Roofs. Cool Roofs, we do a lot. Some people have done some white painting in Andhra Pradesh, Hyderabad, and wherever else. At the end of the day, the whole story is that for 10 square meters of Cool Roof, the cost of that paint is 40,000 rupees. Somebody was telling me it's come down to 24,000. So maybe a discussion with 3 of the top paint companies that why is it so expensive, number one. And number 2, what can you do to bring the price down because you have a massive market waiting for you. So that is another commercial way of taking this thing forward. So a lot of you have done a lot of studies, a lot of good work has been done, but I think we should dive deep into the commercial aspects and we are willing to midwife that conversation. And if any of you are happy to come together again, call those 3 companies, then I can ask all the naughty questions. And thanks a lot.